Hello, fourth graders. I am back to read some more of Farmer Boy by Laura Ingalls Wilder. We are on the next chapter, chapter 4, and it's titled Surprise. So the last time I read, it was we had read the first 3 chapters, and we had learned about what a typical school day looked like for Almanzo. We also learned about what a typical evening and then what a typical winter night was like at Almanzo's house. And now we've got a little surprise that happens the next day in school, or within the next few days in school. So on page 39, go ahead and follow along with me while I read the book. Surprise. Every day at noon, the wood haulers came down Hardscrabble Hill, and the boys hitched their sleds to the bobsled runners and rode away down the road. But they went only a little way and came back in time. Only Big Bill Ritchie and his friends didn't care how soon Mr. Corse tried to punish them. Remember the last time all the boys had rode the wood haulers' wagons? They came back really late, and Mr. Corse said, "Do not let this happen again," right? So the younger boys all are not doing that. They're only going a little way, and they're coming right back. The big boys don't care, right? Because they want Mr. Corse to punish them, because they're hoping that if he punishes them, then they can thrash him and tear up the school like they've done every other winter term. One day they were gone until after recess. When they came tramping into the schoolhouse, they all grinned impudently at Mr. Corse. He waited until they were in their seats. Then he stood up pale, and he said, "If this occurs again, I shall punish you." When they say they grinned impudently, like they were almost like they're daring Mr. Corse to punish them. Everybody knew what would happen next day. When Royal and Almanzo reached home that night, they told Father. Almanzo said it wasn't fair. Mr. Corse wasn't big enough to fight even one of those big boys, and they would all jump on him at once. "I wish I was big enough to fight him," he said. "Son, Mr. Corse hired out to teach the school," Father answered. "The school trustees were fair and above board with him. They told him what he was undertaking. He undertook it. It's his job, not yours." So what Father is trying to explain to the boys is that because the teachers are hired to teach at the school and they're not from the area, they gave Mr. Corse, all the information that he needed to understand how the school was going to run. And they also told him, every winter term, there are these big boys, and they come in and they like to thrash up the school. And so he knew that when he took the job. So it wasn't like he's going in with his eyes closed, like it's a surprise that this is going to happen. He was told what was going to happen, or what could happen, what has been happening in the years past. "But maybe they'll kill him," Almanzo said. "That's his business," said Father. "When a man undertakes a job, he has to stick to it till he finishes it. If Corse is the man I think he is, he'd thank nobody for interfering." Almanzo couldn't help saying it again. "It isn't fair. He can't fight all 5 of them." "I wouldn't wonder if you'd be surprised, son," Father said. "Now you boys get a hustle on. These chores can't wait all night." So Almanzo went to work and did not say any more. All next morning, while he sat holding up his primer, he could not study. He was dreading what was going to happen to Mr. Corse. When the primer class was called, he could not read his lesson. He had to stay in with the girls at recess, and he wished he could lick Bill Ritchie. And when they say lick Bill Ritchie, that just means he wants to beat him up. He wants to, take care of him so Big Bill Ritchie won't hurt Mr. Corse. At noon, he went out to play, and he saw Mr. Ritchie, Bill's father, coming down the hill in his loaded bobsled. All the boys stood where they were and watched Mr. Ritchie. He was a big, rough man with a loud voice and a loud laugh. He was proud of Bill because Bill could thrash school teachers and break up the school. Nobody ran to fasten a sled behind Mr. Ritchie's bobsled, but Bill and the other boys climbed up on his load of wood. They rode loudly, talking around the bend of the road and out of sight. The other boys did not play any more. They stood and talked about what would happen. When Mr. Corse rapped on the window, they went in soberly and soberly sat down. So they went in quietly in just kind of a sad feeling. That afternoon, nobody knew the lessons. Mr. Corse called up class after class, and they lined up with their toes on a crack in the floor, but they could not answer his questions. Mr. Corse did not punish anybody. He said, "We will have the same lesson again tomorrow." Mr. Corse knows, right, that there's this air of gloom in the room. Everybody's worried about what might happen. Everybody knew that Mr. Chorus would not be there tomorrow. One of the little girls began to cry. Then 3 or 4 of them put their heads down on their desks and sobbed. Almanzo had to sit still in his seat and look at his primer. After a long time, Mr. Chorus called him to the desk to see if he could read his lesson now. Almanzo knew every word of it, but there was a lump in his throat, and it would not let the words come out. He stood looking at the page while Mr. Chorus waited. Then they heard the big boys coming. Mr. Chorus stood up and put his thin hand gently on Almanzo's shoulder. He turned him around and said, "Go to your seat, Almanzo." The room was silent. Everybody was waiting. The big boys came up the path and clattered into the entry, hooting and jostling one another. The door banged open and Big Bill Ritchie swaggered in. Right, so he's all confident. The other boys were behind him. Mr. Chorus looked at them and did not say anything. Bill Ritchie laughed right in his face, and still he did not speak. The big boys jostled Bill, and he jeered again at Mr. Chorus. Then he led them all tramping loudly down the aisle to their seats. Mr. Chorus lifted the lid of his desk and dropped one hand out of sight behind the raised lid. He said, "Bill Ritchie, come up here." Big Bill jumped up and tore off his coat, yelling, "Come on, boys." He rushed up the aisle. Almanzo felt sick inside. He didn't want to watch, but he couldn't help it. Mr. Chorus stepped away from his desk. His hand came from behind the desk lid, and a long, thin, black streak hissed through the air. It was a black snake ox whip, 15 feet long. Mr. Chorus held the short handle, loaded with iron that could kill an ox. The thin, long lash coiled around Bill's legs, and Mr. Chorus jerked. Bill lurched and almost fell. Quick as black lightning, the lash circled and struck and coiled again, and again Mr. Chorus jerked. "Come up here, Bill Ritchie," he said, jerking Bill toward him and backing away. Bill could not reach him. Faster and faster the lash was hissing and crackling, coiling and jerking, and more quickly Mr. Chorus backed away, jerking Bill almost off of his feet. Up and down they went in the open space in front of the desk. The lash kept coiling and tripping Bill. Mr. Chorus kept running backward and striking. Bill's trousers were cut through. His shirt was slashed. His arms bleeding from the bite of the lash. It came and went, hissing too fast to be seen. Bill rushed, and the floor shook when the whiplash jerked him over backward. He got up swearing and tried to reach the teacher's chair to throw it. The lash jerked him around. He began to bawl like a calf. He blubbered and he begged. The lash kept hissing, circling, jerking. Bit by bit, he jerked Bill to the door. Mr. Chorus threw him headlong into the entry and slammed and locked the door. Turning quickly, he said, "Now, John, come on up." John was in the aisle staring. He whirled around and tried to get away, but Mr. Chorus took a quick step, caught him with the whiplash, and jerked him forward. "Oh, please, 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 teacher," John begged. Mr. Chorus did not answer. He was panting, and sweat trickled down his cheek. The whiplash was coiling and hissing, jerking John to the door. Mr. Chorus threw him out and slammed the door and turned. The other big boys, they had got the window open, and 1, 2, 3, they jumped out into the deep snow and floundered away. Mr. Chorus coiled the whip neatly and laid it back in his desk. He wiped his face with his handkerchief, and he straightened his collar and said, "Royal, will you please close the window?" Royal tiptoed to the window and shut it. Then Mr. Chorus called the arithmetic class. Nobody knew the lesson. All the rest of the afternoon, no one knew a lesson, and there was no recess that afternoon. Everyone had forgotten it. Almanzo could hardly wait till school was dismissed, and he could rush out with the other boys and yell, "The big boys were licked! Mr. Chorus has licked the Bill Ritchie's gang from Hardscrabble Settlement." But Almanzo did not know the best part of it till he listened to his father talking to Mr. Chorus that night at supper. "The boys didn't throw you out, Royal tells me," Father said. "No," said Mr. Chorus, "thanks to your black snake whip." Almanzo stopped eating. He sat and looked at Father. Father had known all the time. It was Father's black snake whip that bested Big Bill Ritchie. Almanzo was sure that Father was the smartest man in the world as well as the biggest and the strongest. Father was talking. He said that while the big boys were riding on Mr. Ritchie's bobsled, they had told Mr. Ritchie that they were going to thrash the teacher that afternoon. Mr. Ritchie thought it was a good joke. He was so sure his boys would do it that he told everyone in town that they had already done it. And on his way home, he had stopped to tell Father that Bill had thrashed Mr. Chorus and broken up the school again. Almanzo thought how surprised Mr. Ritchie must have been when he got home and saw Bill. Right? Because he was bragging. He thought that his son and the boys had already thrashed Mr. Course, but it didn't happen. So I bet he was surprised when he saw Bill's pants all ripped up and him bleeding and all, the marks all over him, and how that Mr. Course had actually bested Big Bill Ritchie and the boys. I hope you enjoyed that chapter. That's one of my favorite ones. And I will be back again to read some more. Have a great day. Bye, guys.